So what about play? Militarism and play. How has the semiotics, the meaning making around military and militarism been connected to play? Well, we see it probably most predominantly, sometimes we're not even paying attention, in the way in which we talk about sport in this country. In particular, I think football is the most obvious example of this. Here are just some of the phrases, the language that we use to talk about football players and coaches and maneuvers on the football field and how they're connected to language from war and from militarism. So the coach is often referred to as the field general. The players are foot soldiers. Short passes are bullets, long passes are bombs, and rushing the quarterback is a blitz, which is from a shortening version of the German word blitzkrieg, which literally means lightning war. So we have, obviously, again, a trajectory, a history, a precedent of connecting play and war. It goes the other direction as well. We also think about war as sport. We have war metaphors or sports metaphors being used to describe what we're trying to do in the field of battle. So historically, for example, Vietnam War was referred to as Operation Linebacker. So we've got football borrowing war metaphors and war borrowing football metaphors. And that's how semiotic works. Again, it creates a kind of cloud of meaning, of shared meaning around these concepts, around these cultural artifacts. And the Cold War's nuclear arms race, and most recently referring to the weapons of mass destruction mission in Iraq as a slam dunk, obviously taken from basketball. So there is, again, precedent, a history, a context for understanding war and play. And of course, the reason why I'm laying this out is so that as we move into looking at how video games represent war, we understand its larger place in our history. So the next point, pedagogy of war, teaching war through play. There is an ancient history of teaching soldiers, generals training their soldiers, young people learning about war through play. For example, the game of chess. The game of chess was created in India in the 6th century. It was called Caturanga. And its pieces were literally the 4 divisions of the way in which India at that time fought wars. So there was the infantry, which is today's pawn, the cavalry, which is represented today in the knight, elephants are now the bishops, and the chariotry are, of course, the rook. So we have a simulated battlefield in the chessboard, and it's highly abstracted. It doesn't look a lot like an actual battlefield, but the strategy that is embedded in playing the game was seen by 6th century Indian generals as a way that you could teach about war strategy. Same is true with the Chinese game Go, referred to as Wei Qi. Go was used specifically to train generals. Mao Zedong used it. He required his generals to play Go. The board doesn't look like a battlefield. Again, it's an abstracted version of a battlefield, but the concepts of developing strategy and thinking about opposing sides, gaining resources, are represented on the board. More contemporary versions. In Germany, a game was created in 1812 called the Cricks Field, which literally means war game. And a Prussian general at the time said, this is not a game, this is training for war. So like the history of Go and the history of chess, here we have yet another sort of abstracted version of a battlefield, and using this game to teach the strategy, the thinking around war. Things that probably look a little bit more familiar to you. Board games, of course, have a history as well connected to militarism. The game of Risk, which is a game of world domination, of resource management, trying to gain land, and by the amount of land you gain, the more you win the war. Axis and Allies being also resource management, reenactment of World War II. So these boards look a little bit more like the actual battlefield. They're a map of the world, so they're not quite as abstracted. In the 1960s and 70s, an incredibly popular pastime of folks who were either professional or simply amateur enthusiasts of war strategy were to play war board games. I had the privilege of interviewing one of the most prolific creators of war board games from the 70s, James Dunnigan, in the book Joystick Soldiers, and he was telling me how he had active military leaders coming to their design meetings and wanting to help advise how these games, these pencil and paper games, were being created. And of course, the designers were happy to hear the active military people's stories because they could incorporate them into the strategy. So these games are being played by enthusiasts, sort of war historian enthusiasts, and also being used by active military themselves. James Dunnigan told me several stories of having some folks from Pentagon come to their play nights to essentially play out potential strategies that they saw happening in the world scene. What happened to the war board game movement? It was very popular. These games sold hundreds of thousands of versions. They were published by two companies called Avalon Hill and SPI. Well, when the computer came around, they started to see interest in the paper and pencil ones disappear, because the computer was now the place where you would take the simulation of war, and instead of having it on paper and pencil, you could have it inside of a computer machine. And that brings me to a very short history of the video game. And it's a contested history too. Not everyone would agree that the history of the contemporary video game industry started in Boston, MIT, but being from Cambridge, I'm going to privilege that history myself. So, the military entertainment complex. We're now looking at the industrial relationship between the video game industry and the military. What do I mean by industrial relationship? I literally mean units, organizations, companies, personnel, money being directed towards creating military products and entertainment products at the same time. That's the relationship between military units, and you'll see some examples in a moment, and entertainment units, organizations, institutions working together for their own goals but using the same resources. This starts in the history of video games in the early 1960s. At MIT, there was an institute called the Hingham Institute Study Group on Space Warfare, and they were given a very large computer from the Pentagon. It was called a PDP-1, and it was massive. It's told that it takes up the size of 3 refrigerators, but it had the computational power of a contemporary calculator. But it was a big deal back then, right? I mean, for computational power, it was the top of the cream of the crop. So this piece of equipment was given to this institute by the Pentagon, so it was funded by Pentagon dollars. And they were told, do something with this. What can we do with this computational power? So graduate students, as they were wont to do, messed around on this big piece of technology and created, one of them, Stephen Russell, created something called Space War. Space War, as he says himself, is essentially a simulation. It's a missile simulation. It's a physics engine. It takes all of the information that they know about physics when it comes to missiles, trajectory and thrust and so forth, friction, and tries to simulate what would happen if you sent a missile off in this direction with this amount of thrust, and would it hit its target in space. And so it looks a lot like a game, but it also is simulating something quite real. So that is essentially what Russell is saying here when he says the most important feature of the program is that one can simulate a reasonably complicated physical system and actually see what's going on. That's the leap forward that video games can do, or did, for simulation of war, is that it could take a lot more information than a human being could hold in their head at one time and compute the outcomes fairly quickly and do so in a manner that you could see without having to use paper and pencil, which is one of the reasons why the paper and pencil war games disappeared pretty quickly, because this is so far superior. So that's sort of the beginning of the relationship between Pentagon-funded projects and video games. What ends up happening over time, about 10 years later, this development of using games to simulate things spawns 10 years later in 1971, Nolan Bushnell's Pong. And of course, Pong, the rest is history, as they say, Pong being the first extremely successful commercial video game that is often seen as sort of the father of the video game, or I guess by now the great-grandfather of the video game industry. So very much like the internet, which was developed by in conjunction with the Pentagon and universities, military dollars, government taxes or funds and so forth, to create something that we now all use for commerce, for entertainment. The video game industry has a similar history. Since then, the military has continued to work with video game and entertainment companies to create both products that can be sold to consumers, games that will consume and play, as well as products for military strategy, military ends. The group, the sort of consortium group that now exists within the United States Army that does this is Ph.D, Program Executive Office for Simulation Training and Instrumentation, and I have a short clip here of the director of that program, where he essentially very quickly and succinctly lays out this relationship that he sees between the military's ends, concerns, objectives, and the entertainment industry and their creativity.
Hello, I'm Jim Blake, Program Executive Officer for Simulation Training and Instrumentation, or PEO-STRI. We are co-located in Orlando with the other military services simulation offices. Being close to the theme park central and the companies that support the world's entertainment industry really helps with what we do. So what do we do? Well, we are the organization in the Army that designs and buys simulations, training equipment, and instrumentation that helps our soldiers be as proficient as possible in their jobs. If you have ever played a first-person shooter game, a bird's eye view strategy game, played laser tag, or been in a simulator, you have an idea of what we do. We employ entertainment principles, capabilities, and technologies, but the tools we develop are used for the serious business of training soldiers or testing equipment. We group those tools into live, virtual, and constructive simulations. Live simulation is real people in real environments. An example of a live simulation would be laser tag. Virtual simulation is real people in synthetic environments. Driving and flight simulators are examples. And finally, in constructive simulation, we have synthetic participants in synthetic environments. Many PC-based games fit into this domain. For the Army, constructive simulations are focused on leader and battle staff training.
So, just in that brief clip, you hear him talking about how they see the Army has, sort of three objectives here. They might have simulated experiences that involve real soldiers in a simulated environment, real soldiers with simulated soldiers, and simulated soldiers against simulated soldiers. And so he's talking about all three of those experiences through products that we're familiar with, right? Laser tag is real soldiers against real soldiers in a simulated environment. Flight simulators is real soldier purely in a simulated environment with simulated opponents or other simulated soldiers. And then something like the PC world is you have a simulated avatar, your character, moving around a simulated world with other simulated soldiers or opponents. And he sees the video game industry and the other entertainment industries, in Orlando, Disney and Universal, as being key components in helping them create products that meet the needs of the military. So this relationship obviously is ongoing. Here's some examples of current and under development games that the Army is working on right now, and some of their consumer-based ancestors. So asymmetrical warfare environment is based on MMORPG technology. MMORPG are things like World of Warcraft, persistent universe technology is what it's called. Elect Belat, which is a diplomatic kind of game, teaching negotiation skills for soldiers who are going into the field, is based on the Unreal 2 engine, which is a very popular first-person shooter game. Star Wars Ambush, based on Operation Flashpoint. Again, that was a retail game available for retail sale. And Virtual Iraq is based on Full Spectrum Warrior. Virtual Iraq is really interesting. It is a post-traumatic stress disorder therapy program. The idea is that when a soldier comes back from service overseas, if he or she has seen a lot of violence and a lot of action, they may be suffering, as a third of our soldiers do when they come back, some form of post-traumatic stress. And this video game, this simulated environment, helps the soldier work through some of their trauma in a therapeutic environment. So they are driving around in, for example, an armored Humvee, and they're hearing guns go off around them, and a therapist is there to help them get through that without panic attacks, without breaking out in sweats and so forth. Again, amazingly powerful ends, objectives, based upon fairly readily available, retail-oriented, consumer-oriented technology. So here's the military entertainment complex as a diagram. You have the U.S. Army and its needs and objectives. You have video game industry and other entertainment industries, film studios, even television writers and so forth, and video game production companies. And a third arm, which I'm not going to talk so much about today, but it's equally as important as a player in all of this, is research institutions, universities, right? The one that I've highlighted here, which tends to be one of the most prolific, working inside of this military entertainment industrial complex, is an Institute for Creative Technologies, ICT, at the University of Southern California. That institute was created and continues to exist today with a dual purpose. And the money to run that institute comes from the Pentagon, right? So it's tax dollars filtered through a military budget from the Pentagon and from the entertainment industries. And the mission of ICT is to do two things, is to essentially serve two masters in a way, is that the research and development that happens at ICT in the university through faculty, researchers, graduate students, and so forth, is to create products that both serve military ends and entertainment ends. Things that the military can plug right into their PO-STRI requirements, things they're going to use in the field or things they're going to use to help soldiers recover when they return. Training simulators, there's all kinds of stuff coming out of ICT about first responder training and so forth, homeland terrorist attacks and how communities will respond to that, as well as creating entertainment products that can sell in an entertainment venue. So here's one example of that. This is where virtual Rerack comes from, right? You have these three entities working with a pre-existing game to create virtual Rerack. And there's another example. You have, again, U.S. Army, ICT, but this time Epic Games and Psychic Bunny and Midway. That's a video production studio, two video production and two video game production studios using Unreal Tournament to create Elect My Lab. So that's the relationship in a nice little diagram. Moving on. So there is this precedent, as I've described, this sort of like industrial, semiotic, and pedagogical context within which video games and the military are wedded. They exist. They sort of circulate in our culture in these ways. The last thing I want to focus on is how then does that manifest itself for the player, for us, for society at large, both on an individual level, but then also as members of the largest military might in the world. And that's through ideology. Through the value system that games tend to preference, the value system that games tend to support. And this is also has its historical precedence. The video game industry is not the first entertainment industry to be, in some ways, used for the ends of supporting militarism. The film industry has a long relationship with working with military units, in particular the Army, to create storylines and films that are based upon heroism and, again, the use of military force to solve global conflict. So all of the images I have up here are films that were created specifically for, with the help of, and oftentimes in partnership with, in most cases, the U.S. Army or the War Department, to create ideological or to disseminate ideological values around militarism and the idea that military response to global conflict should be accepted. The Why We Fight films, which I'll talk about more later, were created specifically for the War Department, now the Pentagon, to encourage the United States civilians to support entry into World War II. So there's a history here. One of the things that I've been influenced by is a book that was written in 2005, or published in 2005, by a former West Point faculty member, a graduate from the U.S. Military Academy, and now a professor at Boston University, Andrew Bacevich, his idea of new militarism. And he talks about new militarism as being a marriage of militarism for general support for military tactics, strategy, money going towards military ends, and utopian ideology. The idea that with unprecedented military might, we have sort of a blind faith in the universal values or universality of American values. I think the way that this has best manifested itself, and when I say by best manifest itself, I simply mean it's a good example of what he was talking about. Its outcome, of course, was detrimental, and that's the concept of shock and awe. If you remember, as we were on the precipice of entering Iraq, the idea was shock and awe was going to somehow, the firepower of the United States and the swiftness within which our military might invaded Iraq would just shock and awe the country and essentially acquiesce, and our mission would be accomplished very quickly. And that is an example, a very real example of what Basevich is talking about. This sort of blind reliance on military power to achieve, idealistic and maybe well-meaning goals, for example, of freedom and democracy. So that's one of the things that was influencing me as I started to work through some of the issues that I was finding when I looked at games. I didn't say at the beginning, and I should have, is that I have been playing games since 1978. So I am a lover of video games. I am a video game enthusiast, and I devote quite a bit of my time every week playing video games. But I also can play them with a critical perspective. I mean, that's one of the things that I bring to my video game play, is I play it, I enjoy it, I get all the pleasures that one would imagine you do from video games, but it also often disturbs me, and it makes me think about a few things. And when I started playing a lot of military games after 9/11, and that's what brought me to this. I had been a video game player for a long time, and after 9/11, I noticed that a lot more games were coming out, hitting the shelves, that had a kind of counter-terrorist plot. Sort of began with the idea that your mission was to counter some terrorist activity. And I started to become intrigued by this. Like, how could I understand that the video game market started to become somewhat flooded with games like that? And as I read Basevich's book, I started to understand these things. So, two pieces of ideology, the way that ideology works through video games that I want to focus on. One is the militarism, and the other one is strategic culture. Strategic culture is similar to militarism, and as you see some of the examples I'm going to give you in video games, it focuses on kind of bravado or overstated confidence in the technologies of war. There's a focus on, and again, technological fetishism is a key component of this. There's a hyper-focus on the technologies of warfare and on the strategies of warfare, the sort of on-the-ground strategies of warfare, to the detriment of thinking about larger contextual concerns and questions, and certainly post-war outcomes, post-war recovery, and so forth. And also things like civilian casualties and whatnot, not in that mix. So as I was looking at video games, I was seeing a hyper-focus on these things that is often is referred to as strategic culture. So let's take a look at a few of them. I'm going to go over historic warfare, contemporary warfare, and future war. Most video games military video games fall into one of the three of those. You're either playing a game that is based on some previously enacted war, World War II being the most popular, or a contemporary scenario, Modern Warfare 2 is sort of like that, or a future scenario, something that hasn't happened yet, like Tom Clancy's End War, and I'll get to all of those. Each one of these depict this ideology of militarism and strategic culture. The way that we see it in historic wars is reenactments, again, mostly based on World War II, is in the hyper-focus, the hyper-attention to, again, the technologies of war. The ways in which these games are sold, the way in which they're designed, created, is a ton of creative energy is put into making sure that the game is historically accurate. But historically accurate in particular ways. That the terrain is historically accurate, so that the beach of Normandy looks like the beach of Normandy looked when it was stormed, right? Or that the vehicles are accurate, so that the boats and the land vehicles and the planes are depicted, the physics of them, certainly the aesthetics of them, the look of them, and also what they're capable of doing is replicated as accurately as possible. And that the arsenal, the weapons of war, are also replicated to as historical accuracy as possible. And if you read the marketing materials for these games, that is one of the major pushes. And that, in fact, is one of the major attractions of these games for the people who play them. War enthusiasts, or war historic enthusiasts, are attracted to World War II reenactment games the better their reenactments. So some of the best ones are really the target of enthusiasts for war history and so forth. Not so much mainstream games, but you've got a niche market that really goes after this stuff. So realism is important, historical accuracy is important, and I'm just going to show you one clip. This is for Medal of Honor Airborne, that shows that strategic culture emphasis, the emphasis on the technologies of war and on getting the accuracy of the war arsenal, the vehicles available at the time, getting it as close to historic record as possible. As Julie mentioned earlier, I've done this work on gender and race and violence in games, and one of the things that is sort of a side lecture to this, I could spend a whole other 50 minutes talking about, is the gendered nature of military-based video games. And they're sort of a hyper-masculine environment, as I think that trailer shows. But also the thing that trailer shows, and the more on point, is you saw, again, this focus on weapons. A huge arsenal of weapons that you can use to play this game. And the draw is the fact that all these weapons were in fact available during World War II, and used in this manner. One of the things that's also interesting about this game, and again, it comes in a lot of the marketing material for this game because the makers of it recognize that this is one of the draws of people who consume these games, is they say that the audio sound in the game was recorded from hundreds of real World War II era artifacts. So they got a hold of the artifacts themselves, or got a hold of recordings of the artifacts, including real weapons, tanks, items, and one of the last remaining airworthy C-47s in the world. The audio element of Airborne is immensely detailed, even going as far as recording 2 sets of sounds of boots stepping across different surfaces, one for American boots and another for German boots. And as a result, the game is viscerally engaging, especially if you're playing it on a big flat screen, you've got surround sound. I mean, it really pulls you in. I enjoy all the pleasures that the intended by the designers to really give me a visceral experience. And again, the attention to detail is one of the things that these games are created and sold based upon. Now, it's been pointed out to me quite recently that this game in particular of the Medal of Honor series is the least accurate. That the Medal of Honor series started off as very proud of its historical accuracy, but over time have relented on some of that. Why? Because the series was trying to move away from the niche market of the war historian enthusiast and actually towards a wider market that doesn't care quite as much. And as a result, as my war historian friend says, this game has much more rock and roll, as the trailer suggests, than the previous games, which he sees as a loss. He sees that as a loss. Modern warfare games, including the game Call of Duty 4 Modern Warfare, have a similar strategic culture focus, a similar overconfidence and reliance on the technologies of war, and a support of this concept of militarism, that military might sort of makes right and will inevitably give you the outcomes that you're looking for. This one in particular, act of war, is endorsed by a now former general in the U.S. Army, Barry McCaffrey. Based on my experience, this game is the best representation of the terrorist threat military response matrix. And again, as I mentioned earlier, post 9/11, I saw a lot of these games come out represented perhaps best by the Tom Clancy series of games, the branded series of games. There's several Tom Clancy's. There's a Rainbow Six, the Splinter Cell, and the Ghost Recon. Most of them have a counter-terrorist theme. Most of them rely upon the concept of the rogue soldier, the kind of going off-grid, working outside of the realm of, for example, the Geneva Convention, the rules of war, if you will, working outside of public knowledge, covert operations. The idea here being that terrorism, which surprised us all, certainly in the civilian world, kind of shook our thinking about how wars have to be fought, where our conflicts are coming from, require a different kind of response. And the different kind of response that is required, that I'm saying these games suggest, is what is generally understood by the larger international community as war crimes, right? Assassinations, torture. Again, working outside of a military organization is a covert op. Things like hiring militia groups like Blackwater to do some of the dirty work of the Army. All of those things fall outside of what is generally accepted as humane acts of war, humane strategies during wartime. And that's one of the themes of a lot of the modern war games. In Splinter Cell, an ad for this particular version of Tom Clancy's Splinter Cell, just to highlight this, I alone have the fifth freedom. This is supposedly Sam Fisher, who's the main character of the Splinter Cell series, talking. No. Yeah, Sam Fisher. I alone have the fifth freedom, the right to spy, steal, destroy, and assassinate, to ensure that American freedoms are protected. If captured, my government will disavow any knowledge of my existence. So I would add to this strategic culture concept in the modern war games, contemporary-based games, this idea of the sort of off-grid, covert op, rogue soldier as a strategic need now in the Army. It's almost as if our military response requires this. We'll disavow knowledge of it, but in order to successfully respond to terrorism, this piece of our military strategy is now required. It's also reflected in the incredibly popular Call of Duty 4, Modern Warfare 2, this concept of strategic culture. That game I have found very interesting, as well as Army of Two, for something that they did slightly different than all the other games I had looked at to this point. They both actually have a kind of internal critique. It's heavily saturated in patriotism and militarism and strategic culture, but it's there, and I was intrigued by it when I saw it. Army of Two is essentially, one way of reading it, is a critique of the Blackwater scandal. Blackwater is a private company that makes itself available to the U.S. Military to do some operations in Afghanistan and Iraq. They're paid to do these. It's a typical military contract relationship. And some of the things that they were doing were securing certain areas, disarming weapons, and so forth. And it came out, it was revealed that they had, a mission had gone wrong, and they had killed some civilians in Iraq. And this, of course, created a controversy because they're not protected by military rules because they are a private contractor. Should they be brought up under war crimes? Well, they're not exactly a military entity, should they be brought up on simply murder? And so an investigation was created, and it was found out that this kind of mercenary mission stuff, hired militia, was happening in many parts of the U.S. Military strategy. So this game kind of talks about that. I mean, you play one of two guys who are employed by a similar Blackwater-esque company, and you are in Afghanistan, in Iraq, you're doing these kinds of missions, and all throughout you're kind of commenting on, we're doing the dirty work the U.S. military won't, but at least we're getting a big paycheck for it. So again, there's a sort of running critique, a recognition that there's something wrong here. But at the end of the day, of course, the action of the game, the fun of the game, is just getting the mission done, which is to use quite an arsenal to achieve those ends. Modern Warfare 2 has a scene that I can talk about later. I don't want to spend too much time on it. This scene that happens in an airport that everyone has talked about that has to do with sort of civilian casualties. But if we have time, I'll talk about that. And then finally, proleptic war, future war. The concept of strategic culture and militarism even exerts itself, the value system of both of those concepts even exert themselves in games about future wars, right? Games about conflicts that haven't happened yet, but that could happen. I'm not talking about sci-fi based stuff that involve aliens, like Halo. I'm talking about wars that look like they're feasible right here, on planet Earth with humans. So for example, a future war with China, right? Or a future war with some other rogue state, Russia, for example. Or some faction of terrorists that have gotten big enough that they've created a World War III. But these games have a very similar attention to, again, the technologies of war. Now, granted, these technologies are technologies that don't exist yet, right? Guns and ammo that we haven't seen yet. But the underlying idea is that it is those technologies, those future weapons that we haven't developed yet, but that we probably know are in development. They will, again, save us. They will be the means by which our ends are achieved. And I'll show you Tom Clancy's End War that exemplifies, again, strategic culture for future conflict.
If you are watching this, the end has begun. Infantry Strategy Declassified Brief. Executing proper infantry strategy is crucial to your troops' survival in battle. Infantry units are extremely vulnerable out in the open. It is crucial that you direct them to cover, using buildings and barricades to protect them. These tactics will not only protect your troops, but also improve their combat effectiveness. Infantry units in cover can shoot farther and inflict more damage. And engineers in cover become predators for gunships and armored vehicles. Infantry units are also able to set traps and ambushes for oncoming enemy troops. Watch out, though. Cover can be destroyed by firepower, so keep your infantry mobile. Don't forget to use transports to move your infantry units quickly from point to point, as well as to avoid getting trapped in the open. If you keep your troops alive, they will climb in rank. Veteran infantry have access to more abilities that increase their combat effectiveness. The environment can be your friend, or it can be your enemy. Use it to your advantage.
So, to conclude, my point about this focus on ideology is to suggest that military-themed video games, they have a socializing power, very much like film and television and other media, comic books. They have a socializing power. In a sense, they train society, both civilians and real soldiers, to accept militarism with very little discussion. There's not a lot of room for critique and conflict in the ideology supported by military-based video games. The Why We Fight films, prior to U.S. entry into World War II, I think provide an interesting analogy here. I would suggest that video games are the Why We Fight films of this generation, but they're not focused on so much on why we fight. they're the how we fight films of this generation. The why we fight films were created prior to the U.S. entering World War II, and they were created to teach as a pedagogical tool and as a persuasive tool, a piece of propaganda, to teach the American public why the U.S. needed to enter World War II. There was widespread reticence to entering into another global conflict following World War I. Many people still remembered that and its devastating effects. So the American public had to be convinced this is something worth spending money, time, and sacrificing citizens for. So Frank Capra, a film director at the time, filmmaker in Hollywood at the time, who had been famous for things like Mr. Smith Goes to Washington and the Christmas film. I never remember what it's called. Sorry. It's a Wonderful Life. Thank you. Complete blank. It's a Wonderful Life. He was hired by the Pentagon to make a series of 7 films, and the focus of these films was to explain why we should, as the United States, should enter the war. They were also shown sort of as newsreels before films in theaters, and they were also shown to new draftees once we entered the war, so they would understand why they were sacrificing themselves. So, in that tradition, in a way, I think video games serve a similar purpose, but again, as a how we fight focus. The purpose that games today serve, as games have served throughout history, like chess and Go and so forth, is to teach society, particularly young people who will be fighting wars, about the ideological reasoning behind military conflict or military response to global conflict. And by showing players how we fight, warfare becomes sort of morally acceptable when you focus on the technologies of war and as a response to global conflict. Some of the problems with these representations that I find, this sort of hyper-focus on strategic culture and on this new militarism, this overconfidence in our military power, is that they often lack historical context. So although you are told there is a terrorist threat that needs to be annihilated, the sort of larger context for where does terrorist cell come from, what's its relationship to the existing population, why does Al-Qaeda exist in Afghanistan, Taliban exists in Afghanistan and Pakistan, all of that stuff is lost. And most games certainly do not address the civilian casualties as a result that accompanies most assaults. While our technologies, our arsenals have gotten more effective, they also have gotten more deadly. So if the intelligence is flawed or the target hit is incorrect, it is equally as deadly to that potentially innocent civilian population as if the target was the intended. The games don't, of course, focus on rebuilding post-war. There's very little discussion or understanding about what happens post the war. The other thing that I find very disturbing, particularly about contemporary terrorist-based games or counter-terrorist-based games, is that the enemy has been othered, very much like how you dehumanize an enemy in order to be able to stomach the idea of destroying that enemy. Video games have done a similar thing throughout its history, but currently what's happening is that you're seeing the enemy in a counter-terrorist game being represented as a sort of nondescript Arab or Middle Eastern, with very little understanding about which of the many Arab countries this person has come from. The idea that the only people who exist in the Middle East are terrorists, that there aren't populations, families, people trying to make a wage, raise kids, educate themselves, prosper, so that when you go into the Afghanistan theater, you only see people shooting at you. You don't see the people there who are trying to dodge bullets, for example. And overall, it normalizes the use of military force. There's very little opportunity for a diplomatic response, and certainly once you insert the coin, so to speak, in most of the games that I featured here, you have to use violence. Otherwise, boom, you're dead and you're restarting the game. There's no way to progress without the use of military force. So again, alternatives to that don't exist. And in question and answer, we can talk about all kinds of reasons of why that is the case. So while the military entertainment complex is being used to create technologies that can help train our soldiers so that they are safer, so that they survive, so that our strategy during war hopefully is more accurate. This, for example, is a gentleman sitting in the cockpit of an unmanned aerial vehicle. So he is at home base, essentially with a joystick, maneuvering an unmanned vehicle that has a weapon system on it so that we can deliver bombs and bullets to a place without putting U.S. soldiers, human beings, in harm's way. Of course, the people who are on the ground are in harm's way, but the person who's controlling the joystick at the other end is not. One of the things that's interesting about the use of the unmanned weapon system is that they're finding equal amounts of cases of post-traumatic stress syndrome in people who never actually leave the U.S., but who have these kinds of deployments. So they are deployed into a simulator like this to control an unmanned weapons arsenal. They're having just as much post-traumatic stress because they're doing this, and then they're getting in their car and driving home off base and playing soccer with their kids. And the disconnect between I just blew up a town and now I'm playing soccer with my kids is almost equally, if not at least in a different way, and if not even more so traumatic than going over for 18 months for deployment, being surrounded by that environment 24/7, and then trying to re-enter. They're finding that there's a post-traumatic stress related to having to switch back and forth within a 24-hour period when you're on work and when you're off. So these technologies are in conjunction with the video game industry, are being used for military means, for military strategy, for, again, post-traumatic stress disorder therapy and so forth. But I would argue they're also being used on the civilian population, those of us who consume military-based video games, as a way of enculturating us into the naturalization of military response to global